the gatekeepers of UFO secrecy are inherently members of the deep state. People are summoning these craft, with these side capabilities. If the UFO was a grift, all of the people, these media organizations need money. And I know this is like, it's so crazy that I'm like uncomfortable even sort of like saying it out loud.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Watch Mojo and the Unveiled podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and today's guest is Lester Nare. He is an advocate for UAP transparency. He is also the creator of UAP Caucus and the director of operations for the UAP Disclosure Fund. And Lester, I'm really excited to talk to you today. Thanks for joining us.
Likewise, pleasure to be here.
I'm interested in how you got interested in UAPs in the first place. I know you have a background in tech and real estate. How did the UAP topic pique your interest?
Yeah, so I think a lot like many folks, it was a little bit of a roundabout path, but there are little elements throughout my life that kind of led me here. I think the three key factors were when I was growing up, I'm a child of Zimbabwean immigrants, so academics was really important. I played soccer my whole life. And so the number one memory I have growing up of things that didn't involve studying or playing soccer with my dad was we would fly around model rockets and model planes. And so that gave me a little bit of exposure to the concept of aviation or aerospace at a young age. And then I personally had a very, very mundane, what I believed to be UFO sighting in 2012, when I was 21, 22. And at the time, I didn't really know what to do with it. It was weird, but could have maybe been conventional. But that had sparked sort of my own personal reference point because at that point I'd obviously seen a bunch of the lore around the UFO subject, but it was just that for me, lore. And then 2016, when the WikiLeaks dumps came out, that was really what took me over the edge because as a part of that, there were a couple of emails between some folks within government, et cetera, talking about this concept of disclosure as it relates to the subject of UFOs or UAP. And having been a sort of policy wonk, a sort of politico, that was like an arena that I felt like was grounding for me. And I was like, oh, I understand how this ecosystem works and how like political incentives work. So I was very curious by the sort of positioning of this idea of UFO disclosure. And once 2017 rolls around and the New York Times article comes out, much like many folks, that was kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of taking it from private behind the scenes conversations into sort of speaking about it in a public context.
Yeah, 2017 was kind of a turning point for myself also in terms of like really taking a serious look at this and following it closely as things developed because it really kind of accelerated from there. Can you describe that first encounter that you mentioned in 2012?
Yeah, so I was I was living in North Carolina at the time, and just in a suburb of Raleigh. I was out walking in my neighborhood. It was maybe just after dusk, and it was a sort of the classic amber orb that you hear a lot of. Interestingly enough, with the recent New Jersey drone incursions, quote unquote drone incursions, this amber orb morphology has actually been referenced on more than one occasion, and that's actually generally across the U.S., just not New Jersey. But it was perfectly circular, um, moving in a sort of non-linear, very weird pattern. And the thing was, it wasn't like a singular orb. It kind of formed into multiple and then a singular one. And it's really honestly hard to sort of verbally describe. I could probably design like a little computer program to like display, like to sort of show the simulation of what it was like. But I think the thing that was so bizarre about was the movement to me. I mean, we lived on a flight path to RDU and, having my history of knowing aviation from like I knew what conventional flight looked like. And it's not stationary and making abrupt, you know, changes and, vector changes. And it just was very, very, very bizarre. Um, you know, to this day, I don't know what it was, but I always couch it as it wasn't close enough. It was relatively, at least 10,000 feet, distance. Like, or like it was probably flying around 10,000 feet or so. So like it was so far, It wasn't a close encounter. It wasn't definitive. So it was interesting, but I've always ever couched it as being interesting, but nothing really beyond that, just because I don't have enough data.
Right. On the note of the New Jersey drones, do you see those as kind of like how do you interpret the reaction from the White House in terms of like the addressing those? Because it was kind of unsatisfying the way that the Trump administration kind of said, "Oh yes, we know what all these are. They're FAA approved or whatever." I don't think anybody really buys that. What's your interpretation of that statement?
It's interesting. Basically, both the previous Biden administration and the current Trump administration effectively said the same thing with a different word salad, which is it's not our enemies, uh, uh, but we can't be specific beyond that. Which again is it's just a very, I mean, this is part of the reason for a lot of folks who are advocating this space that we touch on this is there is the anomalous aspect, but there's also the conventional conversation around this, right? If you know, if you have kids, you have a family, the last thing you want is some unknown aerial vehicle flying over your house, you know, without cause. And that's effectively what we were seeing with the Jersey drone explanation. I do think, unfortunately, the initial response from the Trump admin was effectively trying to claim victory without doing the work. And, that's, no one is really buying it, obviously. It just doesn't comport with the facts, which is that the FAA literally created a no-fly zone in New Jersey specifically for drones. So you can't both have that be true and then also say that they were all FAA approved. So it's literally false based on what the FAA's actions were at the time. And I mean, just as another corollary to this, this has been something that's been happening over the continental United States for several years at this point. I mean, the big one that was most recently talked about was over Langley Air Force Base at the end of last year. But this is not new. It is not exclusive to New Jersey. It's also not exclusive to the United States, as we saw, obviously, incursions over U.S. military bases, both in the UK and Germany. So there's clearly more to the story on the quote unquote drone incursions than what's been stated. And one of the challenges with navigating this issue amongst members of Congress is sort of the sort of intersection of conventional unmanned aerial systems or UAS, so like drones, with this term of art that we've come up with, UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomenon, which is meant to explicitly not include things like drones if you were to look at the definition that was provided in the proposed UAP Disclosure Acts of 2023 and 2024, which explicitly said UAP do not include conventional aircrafts like drones.
Right, and it's a bit interesting how the term drones was the predominant term used to describe everything that was seen while this activity was happening over New Jersey, whether it was, and there were orbs, there were all kinds of different things, and there were conventional looking drones, but it was all kind of lumped together and termed as drones, which is an interesting thing.
I think this is why semantics it is really important, which is why, a lot of folks on the advocacy side have been really pushing to get a statutory definition for UAP updated to be more specific, because to your point, we saw a variety of morphologies happening. We saw a lot of conventional normal aircraft being misidentified as conventional drones. We saw a lot of these fixed wing SUV sized, conventional drones. And then the third bucket was these orbs or other types of light phenomena, which are kind of like a whole, like we're very weird and in a wholly separate bucket. But to your point, they all just got framed as drones, even though some of them were planes and helicopters, and some of them were luminous orbs, flying at low altitude, not necessarily, at great distances. So I do think that as we have this discussion, and this is kind of the challenge again, because and the reaction, it was like, oh, we're going to do something about this drone stuff. Oh, and also let's just loop UAP into that same category. And there are uniquely different challenges as it relates to drones or any other unmanned aerial systems. And there's like important work to be done there. For example, like dealing with the issue of what happened. There's no authority to shoot them down over the US. And so like that's a challenge. It's difficult to do over heavily populated areas, but like there's a lot to do just on the conventional issue that has a different set of problems than the UAP issue, which has like a constitutional crisis type of element. It has a waste, fraud, and abuse element. It has sort of conventional white collar and sort of, not white collar criminal element. It has a our place in the universe element. So there's like a whole slew of different questions. And so I think interdigitating the two will be a challenge because they both have a large scope of work to address.
I think that since Trump took office, there's been a lot of buzz that his administration would be the most likely one that we've had so far to fully disclose or disclose a considerable amount of the UAP phenomenon that we've been seeing increasingly unfold over the past few years. What are your thoughts on that? I guess this drone explanation doesn't inspire much confidence in that happening. What's your take on what we might see from Trump's administration on this?
I'll just preface this by saying this is a landmine, like a field of landmines around people's existing political persuasions. And so I'll just my view is just on paper, when you think about the history of the types, the demeanor, or the presentation of like different recent historical presidents, none of them have chosen to really uh, be anti-establishment to the degree that President Trump has signaled and taken action to be quote unquote anti-establishment. Um, the UFO UAP issue is one that maps very nicely onto the conventional Republican or GOP narrative about this idea of the quote unquote deep state, right? So the gatekeepers of UFO secrecy are inherently members of the deep state within that sort of political narrative structure. So arguably, the mandate that sort of Trump has put forward is we're going to go after said deep state actors, which would signal that he is more better positioned to be someone to do something or take action on this than previous administrations because he is really, the anti-establishment president or the maverick president in a way that we have not seen in the last several cycles. Now, there's a whole list of caveats that then get associated with that, which one of which I talk about is, the Republican Party's existing, power centers have been looking for control of the Senate, control of the House, and the presidency with a maverick president who is willing to push the norms beyond their current bounds for conventional political things related to the LGBTQ issue or other culture war stuff, the border, inflation, COVID. Those are all very, very much priorities for Trump's constituents. So the question becomes, where does UAP fall in the pecking order of importance? And then that's just one variable. The other variable is there's a belief that this is a move to sort of dis what's the word that Steve Bannon uses? The deconstruction of the administrative state in order to effectively replace it with the private industry, which are a bunch of the people surrounding the current administration as donors. And so it's a purely all of the messaging around going after the deep state is some view as purely self-serving to the effect of being able to move these contracts, capital, and services to a different set of sort of private industry or oligarchs, et cetera. And so like all of those variables are at play here, but I think it is fundamentally true that no previous administration has been on the record in a variety of different roles about having any position on the concept of UFO disclosure more than the current administration. That's just factually true. Whether that means they'll do anything that's ultimately in an altruistic public good sense about that is obviously yet to be seen. But it is, I think, the view there's an opportunity for Republicans to basically get the biggest win that would reinforce their whole core narrative about the deep state by sort of bringing out to the public, arguably, the biggest secret you could possibly bring out as it relates to this idea that the deep state is hiding stuff from you. So there seems to be the opportunity, the political, purely political calculus opportunity, which has nothing to do with whether it's the right thing to do or that the people of the world deserve to know, that exists, even if you don't believe that they're going to do so for the right reasons.
Right. And to start, he did make one of his first orders of business declassifying the JFK, MLK, and RFK files. So we have still yet to see what is included in that, but that does seem like something encouraging in terms of his backing up his words about going after the deep state and whatnot. How relevant those will actually be remains to be seen, but that's at least one indication that things might be moving in the direction of disclosure eventually.
What is so interesting about that note is literally so the deadline they provided a 15-day deadline from that initial executive order that came out now just over 2 weeks ago. And today, as sort of a piggyback off of that move, um, chairman of the House Oversight Committee, James Comer, alongside Representative Anna Paulina Luna of Florida, announced that they were going to be creating a new task force under the House Oversight Committee. The task force name is the Task Force on Declassification of Federal Secrets. And the mandate for that task force is to follow up on and ensure the actual release of information as it relates to the JFK assassination, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, COVID, 9/11, and UAP or UFOs as an explicit core mandate for that task force. And so and they made in statements today that there is some coordination happening alongside with the White House. And I think part of that is because having sort of muscle on the ground to push, when these agencies, ostensibly are going to push back on releasing anything, it just creates another lever to force the issue, in the context of, trying to get, folks to bring that information forward or leaning on the power of the subpoena to compel testimony. Although I just got off a call with someone who does legal work in DC right now, generally, and they mentioned this really important note, which is we're unlikely to see, um, you know, the House uh, uh, issue a subpoena, the House, which is in the legislative branch, issue a subpoena to the executive branch when they're both a part of the same party, and they will just try to deconflict that, privately. So I think one of the things we were touching on earlier was it would be so important that there's actually enforcement mechanisms for all this stuff. The mandate coming from the executive office of the president is huge because that's ultimately the end all be all authority. And, the fact that the White House and the House are both of the Republican Party and they're the same team, you won't necessarily see a combative nature around this, but potentially that creates the collaborative environment for them to facilitate things coming out in an expeditious fashion. It is all yet to be seen, but it's interesting to see that the task force has been stood up in sort of piggybacking off of the executive order that you just mentioned.
Right, and would the establishment of such a task force to kind of enforce these documents to be declassified speak to a kind of struggle that is happening within the government, one to keep things close to the chest and the other to release publicly? I've heard that this is the situation with the UAP disclosure movement, that there are elements within the government that desperately want to keep things a secret and other elements that are ready to let things out. And we've seen this with things that whistleblowers have said, Dave Grush, etc. They're approved by people in the Pentagon to say certain things, but then other areas of the Pentagon will outright deny those things that he said. So there seems to be a contradiction at play, which is a little bit confusing, don't you think?
No, 100%. I think you're spot on. And I mean, this is one of the things that we're really trying to facilitate at the UAP Disclosure Fund is sort of navigating the variety of issues, because the way I've described it in the past is there's almost this authentic, organic constitutional struggle between the executive branch and the legislative branch about who has sort of authority over UAP materials, right? And this whole process. And so there's a couple of layers. Like one issue is the friction between Congress, the legislative branch, they have the power of the purse, they create the laws, and then the executive branch, they run all the federal agencies, the armed forces, the intelligence community. They have to faithfully execute the laws. So there's like a friction between those two entities because Congress is basically saying, I have an oversight authority as an Article One power to have access to the information. And the executive branch is saying, go kick rocks, right? So that's like one thing. And then not only that, then within the executive branch itself, across these agencies, so you have one side of things, which is like the military, you have the other side of things, which is the intelligence community. Within those individual sort of verticals, you also have tension between middle management bureaucrats or staffers or people who are at the fingertips doing work, and then sort of people who come in as leadership at these agencies who are temporary, quote, who are called unaffectionately temporary employees. So just because you have a CIA director or a director of national intelligence or a director of the FBI who may be pro disclosure, it's still predicated on, or it's still necessary that those under the underlings under that director who's a political appointee um, pass the information upstream. Because ultimately, if they don't bring the information upstream, there can be a desire from the head of these agencies to do something, but then not the actual follow through from folks on the ground who are actually within these programs. Um, and so that's like, there's the executive legislative friction, there's the executive hierarchy friction, and then there's obviously the specter of national security as like the undergirding sort of, we can't do disclosure because that means we have to admit to past crimes and we have to figure out who has intellectual property rights over not material of potential non-human origin, and how do we deal with profits generated from any derivative technologies, and how do we prevent our adversaries from utilizing this to, you know, have kinetic, impact on our, armed forces across the globe. What if it has energy implications? What do we do about the oil and gas and the petrodollar, which has been a bastion of how we've projected global power since World War II? There are a lot of really legitimately complex issues as it relates to disclosure beyond just like getting the information out there. I do believe that a lot of the challenges we've seen so far are not necessarily purely about those difficult issues. It's all of this Byzantine bureaucratic, shuffling and power dynamics as a probably leading cause with then those underlying issues, which are legitimate, sort of not even being able to be properly thought about because we're still in the sort of bureaucratic mess stage.
It seems like a lot of people seem to feel that we've reached this sort of point of momentum where it's a little bit hard to get the genie back into the bottle, so to speak. Like disclosure is inevitable at this point, and that we just need to find the best and most effective way to do it. And that seems to be where there's a lot of the struggle is coming from. Do you agree with that?
I think that's my personal view, and I think there are a lot of folks who are in the sort of disclosure advocacy movement who view it the same. I mean, if you look at just polling data, right, around the pulsing the opinion of the American people, I think it's like two-thirds of the American people believe that we're not alone in the universe, and that the U.S. government is potentially hiding information related to that fact. And so the people are already there. Usually government's action on stuff is a lagging indicator on stuff, right? They usually don't lead, they follow. So, and we've sort of a lot of times people will say, "Oh, well, if this secret's too big to keep, if it was a secret, we would have heard about it." We have heard about it. We've actually been hearing about it for decades, and there's been people coming forward for a very, very long time saying the exact same things that we're hearing from David Grush or Carl Nell or Lou Elizondo or Christopher Mellon or any of these figures that have been more popularly associated with the modern disclosure movement, which I couch as sort of anything either post 2017, New York Times article, or post OSAP, which former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid set up in 2008. So they're like the substrate is there, right? I mean, we've talked about this. Crash retrieval and reverse engineering has been out for decades as a concept, and it just appears to just be the lack of the political will to move it out of the shadows of secrecy and into the public eye. Now, I'll couch that by saying in the public, we also don't know what we don't know. And so there are potentially like negative outcomes associated with that that are reasonably grave that we just have no ability to understand. But I think for a lot of folks, it's the issue is so it's a fundamental rights issue that, not only the American people, but all of the people of the globe deserve to know the answer to one of arguably the two most fundamental questions, which is, where are we from, and why are we here? Like this is, sorry, where are we from, and are we alone in the universe? Like these are fundamental questions to our whole human existence. That seems to be something that, uh, despite potential negative outcomes, we collectively deserve to know. Or you could have the opinion of that guy in the Matrix who said ignorance is bliss. So I guess it depends on your cup of tea.
Yeah, I feel like that's a very individual thing, and there's people who would fall on both sides of the fence on that one for sure. Where do you stand on the idea that non-human intelligence is behind a lot of the craft that we're seeing?
I think a large majority of what people believe to be anomalous or unconventional craft are a combination of misidentifications of conventional stuff and our own advanced strategic capabilities. Um, I do think there is a small percentage of stuff that is truly weird. And if you just look at the long history, and this is not even like a history of modern society, even if you go into antiquity, like earlier, 13th, 14th century, like well into the human history. I mean, this has sort of been a thing that has been defined using different words, but has almost persisted through the entirety of sort of the history of mankind when you look at sort of the historical record. Sort of look at this from like a Bayesian perspective. Like probabilities wise, I think it's like over 50%, like so 51 plus percent chance that the small percentage of truly anomalous stuff does represent some form of possible non-human intelligence. And then when you get to like, well, what does that mean? I think the usage of the word non-human intelligence is important as compared to using like the word extraterrestrial, because it's actually not really clear to me personally that we're talking about a phenomenon that originates off planet. And this gets into a whole series of potential classification options, which we've actually put up a great guide on UAP Caucus to a variety of the different possible origins of UAP that include conventional explanations, that include sort of more metaphysical explanations, as well as some of the more popular ones. The extraterrestrial hypothesis being only one of over 90 possible options. So I think we have a very limited scope in sort of the popular culture conversation about when we say non-human intelligence. Usually people think, oh, biological creatures that arose from another rock traveling around another star somewhere in the universe that flew here conventionally and arrived at Earth. And there's like a whole variety of reasons that the extraterrestrial nature of the phenomenon might be not the originating use case. So this gets to, are they, ultra terrestrials? Have they always been here? Is it some proto-human planetary defense system? Is this sort of the Marvel explanation, this interdimensional piece? Is it, time travel? Like there's a whole slew of options. And so I feel comfortable couching it as NHI because it's like there's physical material, right? It's a matter of like where does the threshold of human capability end? And then it's what we're seeing above that line, right? Because clearly, as a lot of folks will say, our black budget intelligence and military programs are 20 years ahead, 50 years ahead. That's fine, but they're not a million years ahead, right? I think we can all collectively probably agree there's at some point, because otherwise you're saying humanity has figured out everything there is to figure out about the universe, and we are able to manufacture and engineer anything to do anything we want, or there is some limit somewhere. And if there's a limit somewhere, there's a space above that which is definitionally can't be us, right? And I believe that that space exists. I do not believe, despite how advanced we are in our black budget programs, that we've figured out every single possible aspect of what you can do and manufacture and engineer from a physics and engineering perspective about the universe. So that's how I would couch it. A long-winded explanation, but that's, we're sort of in speculative territory, so I have to make sure I give the appropriate caveats.
I love some good speculation. And I was checking out the guides on the UAP Caucus website. And yeah, it just strikes me that the alternative theories to extraterrestrial actually, in a lot of cases, seem even weirder than the extraterrestrial explanation. Like, we're talking interdimensional, time traveling, crypto terrestrial, like all kinds of different things. Uh, it's the possibilities are endless, but it's a lot to wrap your head around for people who especially aren't ingrained in this or super interested in like watching all of the podcasts and YouTube videos, which is why I wanted to ask you about the public perception. What's your estimation of like where we're at in society in terms of like being ready for a huge reveal like this? I don't think if you ask the average person that they may be passively interested, but I don't think the average person is like super informed on the UAP goings on, so to speak. There is an abundance of information online, and if you are interested, like it's now is the time. Like it's really popping right now, but it doesn't seem like this has reached the mainstream like critical mass just yet to me.
I think you're right. That intuition is right, and there are a lot of things to this question. So number one is, um, I think for a lot of people, they're at the stage where people have seen Independence Day or they've seen ET, and they've caught enough of some scrolling and seeing UFO headline, even if they're not consciously engaging with it. I think for a lot of people it's like roll out the bodies on a gurney, fly the craft in front of the White House, or otherwise my brain is turned off because I have to pay rent, I have to take care of the kids. Like there's genocides going on, creeping. Like there's all these other things that are less abstract, that are much more tangible for or perceived to be tangible for people's everyday life that just take priority. So I think like part of the challenge is a lot of what's happened so far is so it's like the bureaucracy aspect, the like story of secrecy and the national security state. It's not really like the beef. And a lot of folks are like, where's the beef? So I think that's one aspect. I think another challenge, and I said this to someone the other day, the best time for this to have come out is actually probably between the Berlin Wall falling down and 9/11. And so like 1990 to 2001. And the reason I say that is we're now in an era with the pervasive usage of social media and algorithmic feeds as the primary source of where people get information, which are a hotbed for both mis and disinformation. And it's also bifurcated us from a sociological perspective into like these little sort of niche cohorts, whether it's politically, whether it's gender identity wise, whether it's racially, where we actually have very little fabric of a shared reality anymore. So what we're trying to disclosure is about basically coming to a consensus reality that we're not alone in the universe. And we're trying to have that arise in an era where we've had the most exponential decrease in the ability to actually foster consensus reality about things that are way less controversial than we're not alone in the universe. And so the hurdle is actually like increasing as time goes by because of how information, like digital information and like these information spaces, how they like are sort of programming us. And then the added layer of complexity is the advancement of generative video and generative photo for AI in terms of muddying the, you know, in 1992 it's very difficult, although some people did do so, to like fake UFO media. It is trivial to do so now, which is in part why, you know, like the work we do at UAP Disclosure Fund, there is still a view that the government has a role to play in this issue, because at least for some people, that is still a validating source of defining what is consensus reality. And in lieu of getting some kind of government, like, cosign, the next closest thing is going to be people's own personal experience, because no matter how many times you have a craft landing on the White House lawn on a news broadcast, depending on what channel it's on, people are going to have a certain interpretation. Depending on what political party says what about it, people are going to have a certain interpretation. And so I think it's a very complicated time to actually drive, um, and it's why I like to call it consensus versus disclosure, because in my view, we've kind of already had disclosure, to some extent. Um, Particularly like the first point of which was the 2021 UAP preliminary assessment from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which effectively said there's stuff flying around that we don't know about that's in some cases beyond the capability of our stuff. That's, that's government, bureaucratic speak for disclosure. So I think really what we're asking for, what we're looking for is consensus, which is going to require, you know, uh, the physical evidence piece to really come to fore. Um, Again, because the allegation is that not only does the US government have in its possession, along with other world governments, multiple craft, but also biologics. So it's where's the beef is really, I think, where people are.
Right. And were that to happen, I kind of see that as potentially being exactly what the world needs right now in terms of a grand unifying factor that will bring everybody together, as you mentioned, in this time of extreme polarity and differences of opinion and siloing and whatnot. But if there was a consensus, as you say, and it may take time as different pockets of people kind of like adapt and accept, but once that happens, don't you think that would be good for the world to kind of like come together as the human race and kind of realize, okay, yeah, we're all one here in this universe that is potentially populated with, limitless other types of beings.
I would hope that that's the outcome. I really do. Um, if not in totality, at least in parts. I do think it changes the reference point by which we like look at our own humanity, right? Because basically the even if for a lot of the population of the planet, like there's the theoretical idea that we may not be alone in the universe. There's a large sort of like distance between that and the tangible reality of like we're literally not alone in the universe, and that other intelligence presence is actively with us and engaging with a non-zero amount of the population on Earth on a regular basis. Again, I think the abstract nature of this has been what's been so difficult for people to connect to historically. And so when it becomes concrete, I do think it can have its sort of, I think the recent whistleblower that's come forward, the in modern times, the firsthand whistleblower to come forward, Jake Barber, he mentioned calling it ontological relief as opposed to ontological shock. So there's this viewpoint that the argument is like, oh, people are going to be ontologically shocked because it's going to be so paradigm shifting and they're going to be debilitated and it's going to shatter their perception of themselves and family and all these other things. That's like one view of like how people respond to the information. And Jake put this idea out. It's like, well, for me and for a lot of people, it's actually an ontological relief because deep down, so many of us feel that there's more to this life and more to everything that's going on around us than kind of this box that, the modern capitalistic, society has put us into. So I'm hopeful that that is how the majority of people receive and react to the information. My, I think the challenge is going to be, as is it always is with humanity, is the sort of self-destructive aspect of our nature as it pertains to the war machine, the intelligence and national security state, and the entrenched interests that have a lot of money and have a lot of power and are going to view this purely from the sort of strategic battlefield advantage perspective, which means the only value to this stuff is does it mean we can deliver payloads faster, right? Does it mean we have some sort of military advantage we can gain? And anything beyond that is irrelevant. And it's that's the thing that worries me is this becoming a runaway arms race because depending on the fundamentals of the underlying quote unquote technology, um, it does create a pathway to be sort of the Thanos weapon, the end game technology, not dissimilar to uh, artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence being viewed in the same lens. So I actually think there's a lot of parallels between how the AI conversation is happening and sort of the NHI conversation and like the impacts to humans not being the only intelligence. Again, it just sort of has a different suit and obviously several other different things, but the conversation currently happening in the AI space is almost the exact same conversation, around like what does human sovereignty mean, and like how do we maintain free will, and like all these other things. Um, so I think it's going to require all of us to really push the better nature of our humanity as this continues to potentially unfold in that direction.
Yeah, it's very interesting how the AI development and the UAP disclosure has kind of been happening in tandem, and maybe that's not a coincidence. I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about for sure. There's also been some sort of like framing about UAPs as being a threat until proven, like innocent, right? That's kind of the vibe that I get from some of the people who speak about this, and many of them coming from military backgrounds. So that's kind of like the way that they're trained to think, I suppose. But what's your estimation of like, should we be worried about them in any sense? Like my feeling personally is that if they wanted to do something terrible and malicious, it would have happened already because clearly they have amazing capabilities. So, I don't feel particularly stressed out about it, but there is this kind of like cautious language when referring to them, like we don't know what they're capable of or what they might do. So where do you stand on that?
I do think this is a really, really complex issue. I do agree with you that, like, at the end of the day, we are theoretically talking about something that is much more advanced than we are as humans. So it doesn't need like if it wanted to stomp out the ant farm, it could stomp out the ant farm at any time. Um, just because now saying that, just because they haven't stomped out the ant farm yet, doesn't mean that they will not moving forward. And I think that's always the challenge when you are like in a hierarchy of being, when you are on a lower peg of that hierarchy. I think the threat, quote unquote, is always inherently going to be there because you're operating with something that has a higher consciousness functionality than you do. And as such, it's almost really, I mean, we can try our best to try to discern what the intent is because that's really the key question is like, what is the intent? And um, there are two ways to think about this. Either there's a conscious understanding of us being here and there's like an explicit engagement with us directly. So there's a lot of people who are experiencers or who are victims of the abduction phenomena who, believe that their experience is actually actively having this very direct and personal, like connection to and actual shared space with these non-human intelligences, right? So for some people, they view that as like a negative because that's kidnapping and they're being taken against their will and all this other stuff. Um, some folks would argue that's all a psyop in order to hide the actual true stuff happening by the non-human intelligences, and all abductions are actually being run by the government. So without like addressing that distinction, um, I think it is really hard to discern intent when you're dealing with some thing that is higher on the hierarchy of being than you are. And so and sorry. So one aspect is like they have a conscious awareness of us and they're engaging with us from that conscious perspective. The other aspect is we don't register at all because they're just doing whatever it is they want to do and we're like an irrelevant. And again, it's like you don't think about bugs when you're walking in your backyard and oh I might. So it's like we could just be bugs and we brush up against each other occasionally, but I think Lou Elizondo has this good analogy where it's like, a jet, could be a threat if you're standing behind the engine, but it's not if you're not. And so it's very much about the frame of reference and what our relationship actually is to them, which is always inherently going to be difficult for us to truly assess because they have more theoretical, you know, awareness, power, control, whatever, than we do, which I think brings up this issue around why governments don't want to touch this because it really impacts the concept of sovereignty as nations. Because we all sign up for this idea of I'm from this place, I'm from that place, I pay taxes, and it's a deal. It's like I pay taxes, I do all this work on behalf of my country in return for like protection, opportunity, all this other stuff. If you come out and say, "Oh, there's this thing that's more powerful than this entity you've put all your trust into, and there's nothing that we can do about it, and it can totally interface with you at any given time, anywhere, and that's it. What am I paying taxes for? Right? Like it just unlocks that door a little bit and really creates a little bit of friction around the value and power of the nation state. And so, not to get into I could, as you can tell,
Keep going. I'm enjoying this.
but like I think there are complexities there with that aspect, um, as well. So I think it is a that's some like that those are some of the questions that I think like Reed Summers, for example, who's also been on, is really really well versed in. That's a little bit sort of outside my lane where I don't spend as much time doing the thought leadership there, but it is ultimately the next train stop, right? After the demonstration of existence permeates to more than maybe a couple million people or a couple tens of millions of people, which is probably where we are today.
Right. And thank you for mentioning Reed Summers. But shout out to Reed. And he is the one who connected me with Lester. So thank you very much for that. Appreciate it very much. Yeah, getting back to one of the most fascinating things for me is like beyond the question of are we alone. I think a lot of people have kind of moved past that at this point. But going a layer deeper, and we mentioned Jake Barber already. One of the amazing things that he mentioned in his interviews is that the craft that the military has possession of, or are interacting with, whether they're of non-human origin or military owned, are controlled through consciousness. And he mentioned the military having psychics basically who can interact with these craft, and that brings up so many questions about just the nature of consciousness itself, and what are our capabilities, and like, what is this, what are we as humans, what are we as just beings in this universe. So that is to me the most fascinating aspect of this, beyond just are we alone, and raises so many questions. And that might be something that people have a hard time grappling with, because it touches on religion. It touches on so many different things in the way that we live our lives. So I feel like that could be potentially even more disruptive should that come to light, the reveal of this potential that humans have, much more so than just are there other entities out there.
The psi aspect, as it's sort of called, of the UAP phenomenon, has always kind of been the black sheep of the disclosure conversation, much to many people's chagrin who believe that it's fundamental. The joke is, anyone who gets into the UFO issue starts at the nuts and bolts and ultimately ends in the same place, which is consciousness. If you look at arguably person who's spent the person in the private industry that we know of as the public that has spent the most money personally on this issue, Robert Bigelow, former CEO at Bigelow Aerospace. He was the main contractor that was running the OSAP program, the Advanced Aerospace Weapon Systems Applications program, which was the predecessor to ATIP, the program that Lou Elizondo worked under, which many people know. He's probably spent more than any single individual human being on Earth on this subject. He started with the nuts and bolts, and guess what his new thing now is? It's a consciousness study program, right? And so that is the third. Same thing. If you look at legendary researchers, the likes of like someone like a Jacques Vallée, same thing. It's a control system. It's much more complex than simply beings from another planet, which goes back to the note that I was bringing up earlier. If you're trying to incorporate all of the history of the UFO subject and account for every type of situation, a perfect example of which is, why is it the case that when there's a sighting with multiple people, it is possible that one person sees one thing and another person sees another thing? Well, it's in part because of this apparent consciousness connection between the observer and the observed, in this case, the craft. And I agree with you that this is, you can even see in the reaction to Jake Barber coming forward and just the public response, who historically has been able to like follow along with Grush and follow along with Lou as they've kept it, oh, weird stuff in the sky, we crash retrieval, reverse engineering. It's Independence Day, just like the scene where they said, that's not entirely accurate, sir, and then they fly to Area 51. That's people's viewpoint of it. But when you start saying, oh, every human being has this sort of innate psi capability, there are a variety of ways that manifest. One way is with remote viewing. The other way is with this sort of psionics piece where apparently, and this sound, I know this is like it's like it's so crazy that I'm like uncomfortable even sort of like saying it out loud, as if it's just a part of the normal conversation. But that's where we're at, where it's people are summoning these craft, with these psi capabilities. Um, and then also after they've been retrieved, it is the mechanism by which you actually navigate these things. Um, and I do one of the interesting aspects of that detail that's always existed within the UFO lore conversation, but has become prominent in the modern disclosure conversation because of the new whistleblowers that have come forward, is this idea that like the term crash retrieval is actually a misnomer if primarily the way that these have been acquired is by way of psionics, which means that's why they're not happening in Timbuktu, like wherever where there's a bunch of regular people. If the primary way in which we've accessed, the ability to get close to these things is because we're summoning them, then there is no such thing as you know, a crash retrieval in the conventional sense where it's like, oh, they traveled 90 billion light years and then what? They're just going to crash in our atmosphere. And it's like, well, that might actually be not at all close to what's happening. And it sort of, you know, removes that like knee jerk shutdown, what do they call it? Thought limiting, thought restricting, whatever. It like just it shuts down the conversation. Well, it's like, well, if the and it, not that saying they're not traveling 90 billion light years. Actually, we're just summoning them with our mind is any less ridiculous. I'm not saying it's less ridiculous, but it would explain away that sort of argument about, well, we should be seeing these everywhere and blah, 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 and all this and that. So it is a very difficult aspect to wrap your head around. And what's fascinating is if you've looked at the interviews coming from this new batch of sort of special operators that are really hitting the psionics piece heavily, the biologics is almost never referenced, right? There's so much to talk about, and they primarily focus on this aspect because if you think about it, if that's true, and then there's a genetic disposition to people's capability set, meaning you can be born with more ability to summon or more ability to navigate, you're now having the actual sub rosa Cold War around reverse engineering may be actually more about quote unquote, acquiring human assets, which some people might couch as human trafficking, or a breeding program to make sure that you're continuing these genetics versus like this rush to go capture cash crafts as they fall randomly and you're sort of having to constantly monitor to get there. So this actually might be much more of a human story, quote unquote, than it's sort of been framed as historically, which I find extremely uh, hard to wrap my head around and equally fascinating.
Yeah, the rabbit hole is very deep on this one, and the two previous guests that I had on the show were both remote viewing experts, and they were fascinating to talk to, and very knowledgeable about the government's long history of psychic programs that have been even disclosed to the public, like over 100,000 pages of documents detailing different things that they have done regarding remote viewing and telepathic, abilities and all kinds of things. But where was I going with this? Yeah, it's always been one of the easiest arguments to make is like, how could a craft travel 90 million light years, whatever, and then just crash on Earth? Like how lame is that? That doesn't seem plausible. But as you said, when you introduce the possibility of being able to summon and then essentially hijack with your mind these craft and force them to land, then it starts to make a lot more sense. But then it also raises the question, are we pissing these guys off by doing this? Like, are we playing with fire here?
Right. I think this speaks to, and a small note, there's an interesting overlap here with the launch of the telepathy tapes as being really popular in the same moment that psionics kind of rolls out as a part of the mainstream disclosure conversation. But I think that's exactly right in that part of the argument, right, as to why disclosure is like a right, is because there are apparently unelected officials that are making decisions on our behalf as it relates to a non-human species and our relationship to that non-human species, which, you know, yes, people make decisions on our behalf all the time as it relates to conventional special operations and, intelligence operations and all these things. But generally speaking, those all revolve around conventional things where there's a little bit of a social contract to some extent, even if we don't agree with or understand all the details. It's like, all right, you're going to go like cultivate assets. Maybe you're going to go assassinate some people. Maybe you're going to go like bomb some pipelines or cut some internet cables. But like the scope of work is relatively well defined and understood. It's just when and where they do it. This is a whole different opaque category, and the implications are equivalent to that of like the idea of mutually assured destruction in terms of the potential implications, which is like the eradication of the species as a whole, which we just don't know, but they're engaging with, it's basically sort of exopolitics or whatever, right? They're engaging on our behalf. And I'm not particularly keen on taking down because the allegations after they've been summoned, they'll use, microwave weapons when it's in a close enough proximity to disable it, and that's what sort of leads to the thing actually coming down. I'm not particularly interested in kicking a sleeping dog, um, you know, unnecessarily. And so again, you could spin these wheels all day. I was like, well, if they were pissed off, then they would have done something by now and they haven't. Are they gifts? This and that. So you could sort of spin your wheels forever, but it is, I do not feel comfortable with the idea that there are shoot downs happening on our behalf as Americans, um, that is not being at least indirectly uh, brought to the attention of the American people.
What about the idea of conducting these what some have termed CE5 like ceremonies where they people get together and meditate or whatever and invite appearances from UAP. Stephen Greer is a big proponent of that. There's the other organization Skywatcher that both of us are familiar with, who is that is headed by Jake Barber. Yeah, what's your stance on that? Some people think that that is risky, in that you don't know what you're going to get when you are trying to interact with these other, if you want to call them, well, just call them UAPs, because again, we don't know what the intent is. It's not clear to us, so it may be an unnecessary risk to kind of invite them into close proximity without understanding that.
I do think it's tough. I think it's tough. Um, the way I sort of couch it is like I couldn't in good conscience tell a friend to go do it because I don't know what I don't know. And you know, so I you know, to the extent that people do it and have a positive experience and, are able to glean information that can be sort of disseminated amongst the public, I think great. I do think, it is I mean, it is inherently a risk without understanding the intent. And this kind of dovetails with what people have sort of said about this, which is much like meditation or any of these other mindful practices, uh, or even people who talk about how they use psychedelics or things like DMT, like what your mind state is prior to engagement is like of paramount importance. And so there are people who have negative experiences, but that's because they came into it with like pre-existing negative energy or whatever. And the same thing for people with positive experiences because they have pre-existing positive entry points. Um, so I think it's risky. However, if it's the methodology by which we get more information, being a test pilot is risky, right? Anything on the frontier of any subject is risky because there are unknowns. And I think one of the aspects of humanity that has led us to where we are today is that we have, for generations, for millennia, been willing to take that risk in any number of different arenas you could identify. And sometimes it doesn't pay off, but sometimes it does. And so the question is, are these the Apollo astronauts who are going to, you know, help us get to the moon? Or is this another analogy I'm not quick enough to think of that's the negative of that example? I do think, though, as a last note on this, This is why religion is continues to still be a key part of this conversation. It has always been and will be a key part of this conversation. Arguably, the almost every religious text includes the concept of non-human intelligence, uh, but it's in this sort of spiritual or metaphysical lens. But ostensibly, it overlaps with what people deem to be UAP or UFO experiences, at least in part. But obviously there's a clear um, fear and pushback, particularly from sort of the Christian and Western religious contexts, that CE5 and all these other things are effectively a practice in demonology, and that you're engaging with demons, and you're like bringing them into our world by participating in that. And that is not my personal viewpoint, but I do know that a lot of folks who have strong religious inclinations feel very passionately about that.
Yeah, perhaps not impossible. Who's to say? I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the organizations that you're a part of. The UAP Disclosure Fund has some big players involved: Lou Elizondo, Gary Nolan, Chris Mellon, among others. What is the group's mission, and like what can you tell us about what you guys are working on?
Yeah, so at UAPDF, I joined just about a year ago as the director of operations. And the primary entry point is we're basically one of the premier civil society organizations that are really trying to help facilitate the answering of the questions of how do we actually facilitate the process of disclosure. If you think about any other social or political issue, right, there is a slew of think tanks and these consulting firms and all these people who write white papers and bring together, conferences and meetings such that all of the nodes for whatever that issue is are able to have a conversation and ideate on like what is the solution. One of the things that I've learned in working in the space for a long time, there is no plan. Like there's no plan within the executive branch or legislative branch of like, oh, like here's the 15-step process. Like that it doesn't exist. So in part, like there's sort of twofold: raising the awareness amongst particularly staffers and members of Congress and the rest of the folks in and around the sort of DC space. So it's like consultants, the intelligence community, armed forces. Um, like you mentioned earlier, there's not necessarily a high level of awareness of the fact that this is a real issue. The Pentagon has a UFO office, that this is a normal political thing. So part of it is that. And then the second piece is like helping to think through the actual policy, like structure and implementation of how do we now move forward. So, for example, two of our first policy briefs there, one was Lou Elizondo put together an article about the importance of having deconfliction with our advanced strategic capabilities and the UAP issue. And then our second policy brief was arguably, I've not seen otherwise, the first legal scholarship in a peer-reviewed legal journal, the Harvard National Security Review, on the history, the modern history of Congress's engagement in this UFO subject, and like really sort of unpacking questions around something that's come up really frequently, which is, oh, whistleblowers say they need protections to go talk to Congress. Based on what? Because there's no nothing precluding any member of the government to go giving a protected disclosure to committees within Congress with the way the ecosystem is. There's nothing precluding. So there's a perception that they can't do so, but no one's ever been prosecuted for making a protected disclosure to Congress. And so part of it is like really sort of pulling the threads on these narrative talking points and actually doing the work to say, wait a minute, is that actually true? Or are people just saying that because that's what's been said forever? So those are really kind of the two lanes that the UAPDF really operates in. With the third piece, which is now becoming a really key variable, is the pipeline for whistleblowers. They're historic. There's no If you look at the whistleblowers that have come forward historically, the big ones, it's Grush, who came through Ross Coulthart, the Australian journalist who now works at News Nation, and Jake Barber and his sort of cohort, who also came through Ross Coulthart at News Nation, who's an Australian journalist. So we need to have the capability to help facilitate whistleblowers coming forward with some domestic entity. Like some American entity should be the one at the tip of the spear of this issue. We shouldn't be depending on a foreign journalist to be doing so, which is not a knock at Ross at all. I think he's done great work in moving this forward. There's just a variety of strategic reasons, intelligence, issues, right? As a foreign national, there's a variety of ways in which, it becomes complicated if he's dealing with, whistleblowers talking about classified information for the United States. So there's just a whole variety of issues there. So I think more around that front from the UAPDF will be coming out in the coming months. But that's become an increasingly large priority because of the contemporary events that we're seeing happen where I think again the sort of like you said the cat's out of the bag, the sort of toothpaste is out of the tube, and I think more and more people who have been in and around the quote unquote legacy program are feeling more emboldened, um, now than they were even a year ago, that the environment is not going to be hostile to them coming forward.
Why do you think the American mainstream media hasn't been more active in helping disclosure come forward? It seemed like the doors were open after that 2017 New York Times article. Like it was open season. Now it's fine. It's a legitimate thing to talk about, but we haven't seen too much action from legacy media on the in bringing new information forward with regards to disclosure. Why do you think that is?
It's a great question. People have a lot of arguments about this and have a lot of ideas about what the cause is. I think it's a combination of things. I think one issue is like a generational thing. So the producers, executive producers, the decision makers in a lot of these newsrooms are from the previous generation where this was always heavily ridiculed and total nonsense and would be the thing that ended your journalistic career, which was uh, ostensibly uh, a result that was sought after by folks who've been pushing this sort of disinformation and the stigma out of the executive branch historically. So they were successful in doing that. That's created a generation of producers who don't want to touch this regardless of new information. And it's just their own personal bias. So I think who runs the newsroom matters, and there's a generational gap there. So I think that's one. I think two, there is still access journalism is a thing. And the gatekeepers still have, their fingers in all of the pies across a lot of mainstream media. So as soon as there's a, trial balloon of someone maybe writing a story on the issue, right? Well, it'd be terrible if you lost access to, this, new DOD breaking news that's going to be really valuable. It would be a shame if you didn't get that story. So, people will always negotiate in favor of maintaining their access, which means they're not going to do things that are going to, rock the boat on that relationship. So I think that's the second piece. And I think a third piece is that the information space is so complicated and the media has been so disengaged for so long that the hurdle to get into it is significantly high, and that the pace of the news cycle is so fast that it's just like, oh, just as I was kind of getting my bearings, oh, let me go chase this thing that's easier to deal with, or chase that thing that's easier to deal with. So I think it's like the barrier to entry is like not low to establish a situational understanding of like all the moving parts, because the subject has been flooded with a whole bunch of nonsense as much as there's legitimate information. And like weeding through that, it takes real time. And a lot of these mainstream media places like don't pay for investigative journalism of that variety anymore. It's just not what they do. It's topic of the day, opinion. Let me just fling out some easy opinions and then we can call it a day. So I think those are all sort of some of the main issues. And what's funny is if you look purely from a profit motive perspective and you look at outlets that have done UFO stories, they are almost universally the most popular story of the year, of the quarter, or the most watched video on their YouTube. It's so there is a clear profit motive, even if you weren't doing it altruistically, to talk about the subject because it demands a lot of traffic. And if you're an ad-based business and traffic is the variable that matters most to you, it actually is nonsensical that they don't cover this issue, given how much hunger for information there is. So I've just never been able to understand. They're not even acting in their own personal financial interest by like there's a anyway. So I just it's curious to me. I, I understand why, like it's all the reasons I said. So it's not like um I'm surprised, but the thing that surprises me is that they don't do it just for the money, which I do find interesting. Because people talk about, oh, the UFO grifting all the time. And I'm like, if the UFO was a grift, all of the people, these media organizations need money.
They'd be the first ones on it.
Yeah, they're not flush with cash. So if there was going to be a grift, they would be first movers on it. Anyway,
Yeah, on the flip side, there's no shortage of movies and documentaries and other media coming out about the topic. Like I haven't seen so many Netflix miniseries on UAPs in the past year before. So clearly, there's a hunger for information about this out there, and people are getting it from all over the place. I mean, like look at what we're doing right now. Like who would have thought? And people are shocked in the comments, like. Watch Mojo is covering UAPs where they're doing a podcast. Oh my God, that's so weird. But look, this is what people want to hear about because it's important, and it's worth talking about. So we have to do it. I have one final question before we wrap it up. Can you pinpoint one single roadblock that is hindering the disclosure process that if removed would make things considerably easier?
that's a great question. Um, I'm trying to think about which roadblock. Let me think on this for a second. That's a great question. Um, can I give two? I'll give
Sure.
two. I think one roadblock, arguably, is past legislation. So either the National Security Act of 1947 or the Atomic Energy Act, because both of those are statutory. It's legislation. It's not an executive order, and those have been alleged to be the authority by which all things related to UFOs or UAP are born classified. So those are like the original sin, right? So I would count as like that, and it's like how do you like right that ship, right? Which requires legislative action, which requires getting all of Congress to be on board to like do something about it. And it wasn't specifically about UAPs, either of those two things. And they're so ingrained in the history of our sort of statutory foundations that that's like a real hard nut to crack. So that's one. I think the second is uh the president of the United States. Um, the president of the United States, if there ever was one that wanted to prioritize this issue, it could start and end with that person. And so the will of the president to do it is number two. Um, President Trump has spoken on this issue. He's already expressed that he doesn't really get it. He doesn't really believe it, but it's the number one thing people ask him. Oh, they always ask me, where are the aliens? So like it's something that's asked, but he's not personally super motivated. I will make a note that it does seem to be the case that President Bill Clinton, was motivated because if you look now at the cohort of Jake Barber and all these guys that have come forward recently, they basically all kind of got spun up at this time in the 90s where it appears that Bill Clinton was trying to basically set up his own people to go in there and figure stuff out. And that was sort of the beginnings of the unspooling, where you now have sort of what's being couched as the black team, the bad people, the legacy program people, the gatekeepers, and the blue team, which is sort of this newer cohort of folks who think that something should be done about this. So I think that those are probably, if I had to couch like the two biggest roadblocks, it would be those two. And uh, I say the president because the information is housed within the executive branch, and the president has the authority over all of that information, and he has the sole authority to declassify. So, and the Congress can ask the executive branch for the information. They can draft legislation that creates requirements that the executive branch provide that information. But there's a lot of leeway given to the president to rebuff that. Even if there was legislation mandating that the president do so, the president has the authority to say, because of national security, I don't want to do that. And so it really starts and ends with the executive office of the president, um, as where the mandate needs to originate, and then all of the antibodies through the executive agencies, and then the collaborative effort within Congress can take shape. Now, I say that that doesn't mean that efforts to bring Congress up to speed are irrelevant, because some of those members are going to eventually run for president, right? And if this ultimately starts unraveling, they're going to be the body that holds hearings to unspool this publicly. So it is a yes and not either or. But those, I think, are the two biggest issues: the National Security Act of 1947, the Atomic Energy Act, and the will of the president.
That's a great answer. And I know there's going to be a lot of people in the comments theorizing about how much power the president actually has and what kind of nefarious forces are working against him and blocking different things. But I think that's for another episode. So maybe too big.
I'll leave you with this.
I don't.
I'll leave you with this. If the president of the United States were to go make a primetime statement about this subject in isolation, there's the U.S. government is one of the largest employers on the planet. And if that mandate comes from quote unquote heaven, we've never seen that before. And I think I understand people's pessimism about what authority, like, will he get the information? If he provides that mandate, he or she, whoever it may be in the future, that will change the calculus in a way we've never seen before.
Well, here's hoping that we get more and more information as the year rolls on. And so far, we're off to a good start, I think.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Lester. I really appreciate your time. It's great speaking with you, and I hope we can do this again.
Likewise, pleasure.
Thank you for everybody who watched. Once again, please leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you guys think. I read all the comments. And we'll be back again with more guests digging deeper into the UAP phenomenon. So until then, stay curious and take care, everybody.